how long you can live.
Look, it's my mom's name.
Because I email her a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I don't have to do anything once you fix up the computer, right?
Oh, we know.
On the bottom right-hand corner, you will see this picture pop up.
Do you have your phone and PC call?
Right. It's okay. Right. Yeah, probably the hands up and stuff like that. It's delayed.
Is it live right now?
The headphones would be just like this.
It's live streaming on YouTube. Yes, it is. We are. Hello, YouTube. It's my first time on YouTube. First time typing. That's scary. Someone's watching. That's pretty honest. I think it's disgusting. No, there are two viewers.
What you said, if you could be a little bit quieter, it would help me be able to talk to him to get him online, okay? Thanks. So we'll resend the invite again and then accept we did. Yeah, so if you're open to your emails, yeah. You're in the Chrome browser.
Guys, everybody. Yeah, guys, because there's two people looking at us right now. Yeah. Two viewers. That's kind of scary. Me too.
Oh, you do?
Oh, it's weird. This is like a live documentary.
Nope.
Stop. No. You know the. It's just not. How did they do it? The bottom.
There I am. Whoa, and there you are.
Thank you so much for visiting. Remember to look at the computer, not at the. We're going to start with a question. All right.
The choice of how and why did you narrate from a dead person's point of view?
Now, for some reason, this is breaking up a little bit. Am I breaking up with you?
No.
You guys-
Yeah, I think what you probably should do is come up. Can you hear me when I talk like this?
I hear you, but it's kind of garbled.
Okay. Yeah, I do. Oh, you're connected to it.
Now it's getting better.
Okay.
I hear it. It's like it's off and on. Let me see. Is this me or you? It must be me. Let me see.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I'm not sure why it's. Let me see. Let me get an earphone and see if that makes a difference.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, right here in my pocket.
Yeah, maybe.
All right.
That doesn't change anything.
So you can't. Can you not hear us still?
Maybe it's the speakers, yeah.
I hear you a little better. Go. I think maybe if you talk slow and I talk fast.
Okay. Rena, why don't you come forward a little bit and we'll have her speak a little bit more into the microphone.
Okay.
Slowly.
All right.
The choice of having Billy narrate the sledding hill was very unique. How and why did you choose to narrate from a dead person's point of view?
Now that sounded good. You know, kind of it was a gimmick, and I'll tell you what I mean. Every time you start a book, you one of the things you ask yourself is what kind of voice do I want to use to tell the story? Do I want to tell it in first person or third person? If you tell a story in first person, it means that the first person narrator is kind of like the best friend of the reader. It's like, I'll tell you anything, and I won't lie. If you tell it in third person, it means that that's like that omniscient thing where the teller of the tale is like the book God. You know, he sees everything, or she sees everything. The cool thing about using a dead person to tell a story is you get to do both, because they're dead, right? They can see everything, but they have a voice. It's like a dead guy who was, and it was his main character's best friend. So he's able to do that, but he's able to like bop around and see what people are thinking because he's dead. So to some degree, that it's a gimmick to let you have it both ways, and that way you can create a little more mystery, because if I had had Eddie tell this story, you would only have seen what Eddie could see. But I can trick Eddie if I got Billy telling the story. So that was the reason for it. Plus, I mean, it was just kind of cool having a dead kid tell a story, right? And we didn't have to grieve him very long, because I killed him in chapter 1 and he started talking in chapter 2. Right? We didn't have to feel too bad for him because he was doing all right.
Okay, next question. Oh, next question.
Why did you choose to include yourself in the book, The Sledding Hill?
Well, as you can see, I'm a cool guy. No, the reason was, when I started writing the book, I was getting a lot of challenges on different books. I have 3 books particularly. All my books have been challenged someplace, and they've all been banned someplace. And that's not a real big deal, because if it gets banned, if it gets banned in some school in Iowa or someplace, that's not going to kill me. But all of them have been challenged because of the things I write about and the language that I use when I write them. Well, a lot of my stories are told by pretty tough kids. And tough kids use tough language. And I was a therapist for a long time, and I worked in alternative school for a long time, and I grew up in a logging town. So that kind of language doesn't even blip my radar. But it irritates some people, first thing they think is that if you read that kind of language, you're going to run right out and use it, right? Now, you and I know that isn't true. You might use it some places, but you know when not to, just like I do. But that gets to be a big deal. If you put anything sexual in a book, that bothers people. It's like, oh my gosh, if they start thinking about sexual stuff, they're going to run right out and have sex. We also know that's not true. If I put a gay kid in a book, which 10% of the population of almost every species is homosexual. But if I put a gay kid in a book, everybody thinks, oh my gosh, kids are going to read this and run out and want to be gay. We also know that isn't true. So if I talk about racial stuff, boy, a lot of the things that I've written about race and things like that gets hammered too. Well, I had like 8 or 9 issues that I very often have to defend. Why'd you put that in the book? And I tell them why I put it in the book. So in the beginning, I was gonna choose one of my books, a real book that I'd written, and have it be the book. And then I thought, well, I have this issue in this book, and this issue in this book, and this. Why don't I just make up? I'll make up a book that I didn't write, and I'll put all the issues in it. But what I do know is that the language that you read in that book about banning, the reasons that people wanted books banned are the exact reasons that I hear about my books being banned. And what I wanted it to be real. It's like I wanted you, if you picked it up and you talk about the book banning and stuff like that, I wanted you to be able to talk about something that was real. So I thought, Lori Hall Sanderson is a writer. She's written a whole bunch of books, and they've been banned too. Matt Della Pena, Walter Dean Myers. There are a whole bunch of people out there, and they write different stuff. And I could have used one of them, or I could have just made up an author. But I thought, what I'll do? I'll make up the fictional Chris Crutcher. Now, one of the things you notice is I didn't even give myself any good lines. I gave most of the good lines to Montana West. But I thought if I stick myself in there, and part of it was just me being a smart aleck. But if I stick myself in there, then this made up book, which is a pun on the Russian novel War and Peace. It's War and Peace. That fictional novel covers all the things that I get banned for. And like I say, so it was partly that I wanted to be accurate, and partly I just wanted to be a smart aleck so that people say, how come he stuck himself in this book? And see, it worked.
Okay, number 3.
In The Sledding Hill, you wrote about several topics that are considered controversial. Some schools and parents sugarcoat or ignore topics like self-harm and sexuality. Because of this, some kids have not seen a portrayal of these topics before. Do you write with these types of readers in mind? What advice would you give to kids going through these issues?
Wow, that's good. That's actually a good set of questions. When a writer sits down, one of the things that we have to be real careful of is that if we sit down, if we think of an audience, if I'm sitting here wondering about how somebody's going to respond to what I write, it alters what I write. It's like I'll start thinking, well, I want them to think this. I want them to think this. The reality is I don't want you to think anything other than what you think. And that's the cool thing about reading books. It's like of just the people in this room, different people will have different responses to different characters that I write. And that's what I want to have happen. Because you're probably a better thinker than I am. And you're certainly a better thinker in your time than I am. Because like my time at your age is like the 1950s. So like very different. But as human beings, we're kind of the same. I mean, evolution doesn't happen that fast. I didn't have cell phones. I had 2 TV channels. I used to see the news at the movie theater. I mean, there are a whole bunch of things that were different about my life. But I'm a human being, and so are you, and our responses to things are probably pretty close to the same. So one of the things that I say when I start writing is, I don't necessarily want you to think anything. I want you to go ahead and think whatever it is you think. But I want to tell the best truth I can tell. I want to be able to tell my story in the truth of the narrator. And the truth of the narrator is pretty much the same truth as the truth of Chris Crutcher. In other words, I don't create narrators, I don't create narrators that I don't like, because I don't want to sit around with a narrator that I don't like for like a year while I write the book. I'd wake up the second morning and kill him off. So what I do is I look around at kind of the way the world is, and I look at problems. Now, I worked as a therapist for a long time. I worked as a child abuse and neglect therapist for a long time. And so I was listening to some pretty rugged stories. And I watched people who were people from any given minority group that you want to pick, ethnic or gender or any of those things. And I watched how they got treated, and I watched them get bullied, and I watched them figure out ways to stand up for themselves. And I probably learned as much as I taught, because when you get into tough times, the survival skills that you come up with are the ones that work for you. And they might not have been the ones that work for me, but what I do is appreciate that they're good survival skills for you or for that person that I'm working with. Now, I can't take a story out of a therapy session and stick it into a book because it's confidential. But if I hear 1 story, 5 stories, 50 stories, some truth starts to float. In other words, the similarities of people who are treated badly, or the similarities of people who are bullied, or the similarities of people who are bullies. You know, turn into the characters. You know, I give them those components. I make the character up, but I give them human components to, you know, for how they're going to act in my story. And then what I want to have happen is, I always figure this. I figure if I bring my best imagination to telling my story, and you bring your best imagination to reading the story, that story is going to be better than I had a right to make it, because your imagination, see, that's the cool thing about reading. Your imagination, you get to participate in the story. You get to think about, you know, what do I think of Billy? What do I think of this idea that this is what the afterlife looks like? Because I just made that up. I don't know what the afterlife looks like, but that seemed like a pretty cool one. So I put that out there, and then you get to respond to it, given what your history is, and you get to respond to it. You know, one of the things that I do write a lot about kids that get treated badly. I write about bullying in one form or another. Now, I look back at my life as a kid, and I can remember a lot of times when I got bullied, but I can also remember a lot of times when I was the bully. And most of us can. You know, most of us know there are times when we feel good about what we did, and there are times when we feel not quite so good about what we did. And so if the job of the writer is to throw that out there and then let some conversation get started about it. And what makes me feel best about my writing is that you may read it and have a completely different takeaway than I had. So it isn't that I want you to think anything, but I do want you to think. And then I'll sit around, like I'll talk to a class and people tell me what they think, and I'll go, man, I didn't even think of that. But it's absolutely viable to the story. So that's a pretty long answer to a short question, and tell me if I didn't get it all. I have ADD like crazy.
Okay, who's next?
All right.
You were very involved in fighting censorship and supporting freedom of speech. Was there any particular event that inspired you to get involved in fighting censorship? In your opinion, what has been your most notable loss?
You know, what got me into it, one of the things that happens when a book gets censored is that very often it comes from some kind of conservative group, what's called conservative today. And it'll be a conservative religious group, or it'll be a conservative political group. But today, the word conservative seems to mean real controlled. Now, I was born in 1946. And 1946 was 1 year after World War II. My dad was a bomber pilot in World War II. And by the time my dad was the same age I was when I graduated from college, he had flown 35 missions over Germany in a B-17 bomber. And if you ever go back and Google a B-17 bomber, it's just like a big old tin airplane with a whole bunch of bombs in it. And he came back to our small town, and he was real political. He was a voracious reader. He read all the time, and he read news things, he read fiction. The guy it was really hard to stump my old man. And he was real political. And he was like if you ran for any office between dog catcher and president of the United States in Valley County, Idaho, my old man was your campaign manager. And he was a Republican, and he considered himself really, really conservative. And he would have run a nail through his eye before he let anybody ban a book. He thought he fought a war for that. And a lot of people don't know this, but the Pledge of Allegiance didn't used to have "Under God" in it. I was in the 3rd grade, I think, when they put "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. And one of the things my dad said when that happened was, That's probably not constitutional. And the reason he said that was because one of the big, one of the fulcrums of the Constitution is the separation of church and state. And it isn't because the church is bad, and it isn't because the state is bad. It's that they have different jobs. And so the church is, in his interpretation of the Constitution, and most people, certainly at the time, you didn't want one messing with the other because it messed each other up. In other words, the state had no right to be telling religious people how they could worship, and religious people had no right in talking about how to make law. That was the deal. So when I started getting banned, and I was getting banned by the very people that my dad thought we should be should be separate from church and state, it made me kind of goofy because I thought I grew up thinking this. It's in my hard wiring. The First Amendment to me, I was hearing about that before I even understood it. And it was a conservative guy who taught me it. And he and I disagreed a whole lot in political realms, but we didn't disagree there. So that's where it got started. And then all of a sudden I started getting banned. My first book got banned because there was a guy and a girl in the first book. Was a book called Running Loose. And they were trying to figure out whether or not they were going to be sexual together. And they finally decided they would. And he chickened out. And so they didn't. But just the idea that they thought about it got that book banned. And I thought, wow, this isn't something kids don't know about. There's no way in the world. I could walk into any middle school to high school or anything and say, have you ever heard any sexual talk any place? Nobody. The only people who are going to say no are people that are embarrassed. Of course you have. You just do. This is, turn on your TV, it's all over the place. So then it was about, I put a gay kid in a book, and that book got hit. Anytime I would put a character in a book who fought authority, that's one of the reasons that the Sledding Hill gets hit a lot of the time, is because Eddie's trying to stand up for himself in the face of Mr. Tartar. Well, Mr. Tartar was my 6th grade teacher. He's a real guy, and he was rough. He was scary, and his name was Mr. Tartar. I got even with him. I put his name in a book. Right? I don't forget. I was in the 6th grade in like 1958 or something, or 57. I don't forget. But so when people started wanting to censor that stuff, I'm thinking it's really interesting that they want to censor it, because you guys don't censor things. Certainly there are a lot of you don't use the same language that my characters might use in a book. I don't use that language most of the time either. It's, if I'm using really rugged language, it's usually in a rugged situation. So that's how I kind of got started in it. And all of a sudden, what I found, and again, I'm rambling a little bit here, but one of the things that I found was that if you get in a community where one of my books is used in the school, or it's on a voluntary reading list or any of those kind of things, and a community group goes after it, I'm not the one that gets hit. Nobody, those people don't know me. They don't even know what I look like unless they look at the hardback book and go back and see my picture. And even then, I probably put a better picture in than what I really look like. But the teacher gets in trouble, or the librarian gets in trouble, and all of a sudden they're being told that they're trying to corrupt the youth of the nation and all that kind of stuff. And they can really take some hard times. And one of the things that I've always done as a writer is to say, if you get in trouble with the community reading my books, and you need me to stand up for you, if you need me to say why I wrote the story, I'll do it. And if I need to write it down, I'll write it down. If a book of mine gets banned in a school someplace, I Google the nearest public library and I send 5 copies of that book to the public library. Because I want you guys to know, and I want the rest of the world to know, that this is the United States of America. You can't ban a book. You might be able to take it out of a school, but you can't ban a book. If I can get a credit card number and a computer, I can get any book I want. And if I can go to the public library, I can get any book I want. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But I mean, my first book was challenged in my own high school. You know, so I sent my mother to the high school and she straightened them out. You don't mess with my mother.
I have a question, so I'll let you answer.
Go closer again.
What are your standards on what should and should not be banned?
You can do it.
That's another really good question. My standards are that nothing should be banned. And I'll tell you why. Number one, the very best censor for any human being is that human being. If you pick up a book that you think doesn't have anything to do with you, or it's too rugged for you to read, or it talks about stuff you don't want to talk about, boy, the first thing I'm going to tell you to do is close it and go find another book. And if you pick up a book and you read it and it disturbs you, my hope is that you go talk to somebody about what it is that disturbs you. Because if it disturbs you, there's a reason. I mean, it's like, well, right now, all this stuff that's going on in this country about clowns. Clowns are showing up everywhere and scaring everyone, going crazy, right? Stephen King wrote a book called It. And I don't know if any of you know about It, but in Stephen King's It, there's a clown that lives under the town and eats little kids, right? I mean, this is a bad news clown. I mean, it's a Stephen King clown, right? And clowns have always been like pretty creepy to me anyway. I mean, even when I used to go to the circus and it was just like a regular clown, those guys to me were creepy. And so I'll see some picture online where some person's driving along and next to a speed sign or something, a clown steps out. Wow, man, I close that book. That's just, I get goosebumps over clowns. And I know a whole bunch of other people that do. Other people going, clowns don't scare me, you know, snakes scare me. I mean, so different people have different things. And so the standard is nothing should be banned. But I also, if I'm a high school librarian, or if I'm in a high school or junior high librarian or English teacher, one of the things that I know is that I have limited space. And what I'm going to try to fill that library or my classroom up with is a wider range of books that are going to touch everybody. Now, if I'm in middle school, if I'm a middle school teacher or middle school librarian, there are several Chris Crutcher books that I'd never put in there because they're going to want to read them later in high school. They're more appropriate in high school. And if somebody tells me, if a teacher tells me or a librarian tells me, well, I don't put whale talk in this particular library, or I don't put Staying Fat for Sarah Burns in this particular library because we've got limited space, and I think there are other books that are more directed toward the kids that I've got in my classroom, my students that I have in my classroom. So I'm going to stick that one in the high school library. And that's going to be, so there is the question of selection, of just smart selection. But you should be able to walk into a public library and pick up any book you want. And the thing that I would get into an argument with a high school library or any school librarian or any school teacher is if they take a book out of the classroom or out of the library because of some specific issue that they just can't handle. In other words, I don't want my kids thinking about kids who are having or using drugs. Okay, well, there's a lot of people using drugs, and there are consequences to that. And most books that have kids using drugs, you know, a good realistic book show the consequences. So, you know, the idea that you can keep people from thinking things is not really a very smart idea. I couldn't stop anybody in that room, no matter how. I could be like the principal, I could be the god of your town, and I couldn't stop you from thinking anything you wanted to think, because I think quietly and you think quietly. I could never tell what you're thinking. I can think anything I want and smile all the time I'm thinking it. So the idea of trying to control that doesn't make sense to me.
Let's go on to 6. Oh, okay. All right.
Do you expect your books to get banned? Does it affect your motivation for writing?
You know, I don't write them to get banned, but I do expect them to get banned. And I'll tell you one of the reasons. The very first book I wrote was on a top 10 list that year of the most banned books. Now, nobody had any idea who I was. I was on a list with Mark Twain. I was on a list with Harper Lee, right? To Kill a Mockingbird. 9 really famous authors and Joe Blow, right? How proud do you think I was? But I didn't I didn't write it to get banned. I wrote it. It was a story about a kid who had a moral decision to make, and it was a fictionalization of a real story. It was a story about a coach who had closed the door on his locker room and told his kids that he wanted this African American kid from another school put out of a game before halftime, and they did it. And so the dilemma that the kid, my main character, had was, am I going to play for a guy like that? Because they're headed for a state championship, and all the chips are it's high risk. And it really happened in the world. I didn't know the people so I got to make up the characters, and I got to make up the coach and all that. But that book got banned because the kid was defying authority, and it came out. The first book came out in like 1983, so I mean it's a while back, and it got banned because this idea. One of the reasons was this idea that a kid is going to stand up to his coach or stand up to the principal of the school and say, I'm not doing this, and get pretty ornery in doing that. And so my name kind of hit the censors. It kind of got on their radar. And then I wrote a couple other books that were a little bit like that. And then my fourth book was a book called Chinese Handcuffs. And it was written at a girl that I was working with, a girl who had been sexually molested when she was young, was one of my clients at the mental health center. And she wanted me to write about that dilemma. And she, in fact, she and a friend of hers edited the book, because I didn't have any experience there. I mean, I had a lot of intellectual experience, but I didn't have any physical experience with it. So I wanted to make sure I got it right. Well, the censors got all over that. But her idea to get it written in the first place was that this is something that happens to a lot of people and nobody wants to talk about it. And it's easier to talk about a story than it is to talk about your own life. And I knew that was true. We all know that's true. I mean, I'm not going to tell all my secrets, in class, but I'm more than willing to hear all of the characters' secrets. And we can talk about those, and we can kind of figure out how we think. So when I wrote that story, I really got on the radar of the censors. So almost every book I write, if it comes out, Chris Crutcher has a new book out, the censors are going to know it. The people who want books banned are going to look at it right away. So I kind of know they're going to get banned. I don't care. In fact, there's a part of me. One of the reasons I write books for people your age and a little bit older is that's kind of how old my mind is. My body keeps getting old, but I still like a good fight. So, and I still like to kind of get in people's faces if I think I have the right to do that. And it's a little easier for me to do that than you, because I'm old. But I sometimes think of myself back in those days. So I don't write them to get banned, but I always know they're going to be.
Number 7.
And it's cool because I get to come talk to classes like yours.
Just give them all.
So I have 4 questions.
Okay.
How often do you write? What is the process for writing? How do you get an idea out of your head and on paper? If you have writer's block, what do you do?
Ooh. Well, I tell my editor that I write every day. Just like you might tell your English teacher or your teacher that you do your homework every day. And then sometimes you don't. And sometimes I don't. I try to play with a story every day, at least in my head. A lot of times I I really am kind of ADHD, and I'm not kind of ADHD. I'm ADHD, and I always have been. We didn't have the designation for it when I was a kid, but I'd give the teacher about, 3 minutes to get my attention, and then I could stare right at her or right at him, and pretend like I was listening, and my mind was gone. Well, that happened. Yeah, that happens to me a little bit when I'm writing. It's instead of the teacher, it's the page. And so I'm up and down a lot when I write. My process is, I'll get going on my original thought of the story, what the chapter is going to be about, or what this particular scene is going to be about, and I'll write on it a little while, and I just get antsy. So I get up and walk around and talk to myself. I look like an idiot, but luckily I'm alone, so nobody knows that I look like an idiot. And now you guys do. But then I keep kind of circling back to the story and circling back to the story. So I probably don't write every day, but I think about a story every day. And a lot of times I'll get ideas that don't fit with that particular story, so I keep a list of them. I keep a little file on my computer so that I can come back and use those stories those ideas in another book. And so that's kind of my writing process. I do everything on computer. The manuscript form that you get, like in Word, is the perfect manuscript form. That's what the editor expects. Now, I have an editor, so when I'm finished, I don't have to worry too much about finding one. I've had the same editor. I had my original editor at HarperCollins when I started, back when I was like 35 years old, and when she retired, she handpicked her successor. So I've only had 2 editors in my life, except for one adult book that I wrote in the 90s, and so it's easy for me to get my book seen. If I write it, they'll read it. That wasn't true when I started. I had to find an agent. I had to find somebody who would get my book into the hands of somebody who likes to do my kind of book. So that's kind of the process. You write it, and then I had a friend who was a writer, who was a published writer, and my friend had an agent, and so he sent part of my manuscript to his agent, said, if you like this is Chris Crutcher's address, blah, blah, blah. So she called me up, and she's been my agent for 35 years. So the trick is getting your stuff into the hands of somebody who likes the kind of stuff you write. So like most of my characters are teenagers. They're like 16, 17, 18 years old, a little bit younger in Sledding Hill. So I'm getting them, I'm getting it in the hands of somebody that likes to publish that kind of story. Any writer who tells you they don't get writer's block is lying. We all get writer's block. You get it every day. It's just part of the deal. And anybody in there who's a writer probably knows this feeling. You have this great idea. And boy, you have this great idea, and you sit down and you're just writing away like crazy, and then it just stops. And then you start thinking, that's the dumbest idea I ever had. I don't know what I was thinking. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to try something else. Don't try something else. If you do that, you're going to have the first pages of about 6 or 7 different books. Once you get that good idea, it's probably a good idea. But when you get the first part down, then you got to go and decide. You got to keep saying to yourself, what if? What if? What if? What if I throw a new character in here? What if I make something else happen? Because I've kind of got this main character in my head. Now I got to start throwing stuff in her way or in his way, so that my story moves along. Story works on conflict. When I can't think of the conflict, I've got writer's block. Story requires a bunch of characters. When I can't think of the characters that I want, I get writer's block. Some days, I just don't want to write. I get writer's block. So there are a lot of reasons to get it, but work through it. Now, most of the time for me, if I get writer's block, if I'm sitting at my computer and I get writer's block, I get up and walk away. Because if I sit there and start staring at the computer, next thing you know, I'm playing computer games, or I'm checking my email, or I'm, watching YouTube, or there are a million things you can do on a computer. All you guys know that. In fact, you probably know a million more than I know. So, your computer is your enemy when it comes to that. But work through it. Some days you're just sick of it. So stop. And then go back. The other thing I do for writer's block is I talk to people who know what I'm writing about. Like if I'm working with a lot of my characters are kids that have, some kind of personality disorder, they've had some really hard times growing up in child abuse and neglect, that kind of stuff. I talk to other kids. I talk to other therapists. And I'll talk to anybody. I talk to teachers. Who has more contact with different kinds of kids than teachers, librarians. So, and any idea, once it's out there floating, it's free. Just because somebody says something to you, that doesn't mean you can't write it. In fact, I do that all the time. I'm looking for ideas. I'm ripping you guys off right now. I've got 3 more characters for my book. I'm not telling you which ones you are, so you can't sue me.
This is a perfect. Okay. Going back. Oh wait.
There are a couple of things here. So, going back to the Sledding Hill, a lot of the characters like Montana and Chad were really specific. Were they based on one? If not, how did you come up with the ideas for the characters? Additionally, why did you not add more character depth and personality to characters like Eddie's mom?
Okay, good. Number one, part of the deal with choosing characters, and this kind of goes to your last question first. Part of the deal with choosing characters is figuring out how they work into the story, and a lot of times that's just in the mind of the writer. Like I probably had in my life, I probably had a lot more interaction with my dad than I did with my mom. And because I'm a boy, I probably, there's something about the same-sex parent that we tend to relate to a little bit more than we do the other one. It doesn't mean we like one more than the other or anything else. But like, if I got in trouble, it was with my dad, and if I got most of my conflicts and most of the times that I would go, looking for advice. Especially when I became a teenager, and you're more aware of your sex, your gender when you're a teenager than you are when you're a little kid. You tend to go toward the same-sex parent, or I did. So that was part of it. That was just I had a certain amount of parent-child relationship stuff that I had time for, without making the book like 800 pages and then making sure that none of you guys ever touched it. So there's a certain amount of that. Characters like Montana West, I love that character. I love that character because, and here's one of the reasons. I grew up in a household where male voices were a lot more powerful than female voices. My dad grew up in the Depression. He fought in World War II. They call that the greatest generation and all of that stuff. That's just somebody's name for it. But a lot of those guys in that time were pretty entitled men. And women were more likely to buy into that. When you go back and you look at Susan B. Anthony and you look at some of the women who stood up in history, they had to fight to even get themselves in the history books. There are a whole lot of women who are part of history that you guys don't know about because they didn't make it into history books because white guys were writing the books. And so when I got to college, I was in high school and college in the 60s, so like hippie time, right? And the first modern feminism was really coming alive in the mid 60s. And I took my little male chauvinist self to college and got my stuff handed to me by girls who weren't going to put up with that crap. And I was real attracted to that. I didn't even know I was, but I really was. I like girls who didn't put up with me. And I liked women who, told my dad to shut up. And my mom my mom wasn't one of those women. And so Montana was one of those people, you know, she's got that, she's not going to be told what to do. And I mean, she's at war with her dad because he wants her to be the kind of person he wants her to be, and she is not having it. And I know that, you know, that's a pretty rugged relationship, and it's going to take a long time to fix. So when I created her, I just thought, okay, who do I know that is like that? I thought, well, my first college girlfriend was like that. And 2 or 3 of the clients that I worked with, young, you know, 16, 17, 13, 14-year-old girl clients that I had when I was a therapist, were like tougher than nails. Now that's the character, that's the personality. So I would take a little bit of one, a little bit of the other, a little bit of the other, and stick it into Montana West, and she comes out swinging. And then one of the things that happens when you're a writer, at first, it's like she's kind of, you know, she has a little bit of this person, a little bit of, and pretty soon you've written enough about her, and you use her language, and you use her kind of in-your-face self, and all of a sudden she's a real thing to you. So she's like that for me. Carter was like that for me. I mean, I knew that guy. I mean, he made me stand in front of the class with my arms out and put books on him when I complained. I mean, he was a rugged guy. He was honoring, and I didn't like him, and I still don't like him. I don't even know if he's still alive, but it doesn't matter. I don't like him, and I don't like the way he treated me, and I don't like the way he treated kids. I don't like that kind of control freaky stuff. So, boy, that character is an easy one for me to get, and you can go right through the book, and every one of those people means something to me. That event, the dying, what happened to Billy is what happened to my best friend when I was 7 years old. And his dad was it was a little bit different thing. His dad was because you change it for fiction, and of course my characters are older, and actually his name was Eddie. The kid in my real life that died was a kid named Eddie Breidenbaugh. And his dad was the janitor at our school. It was a real small school, so there's only one janitor. And Eddie was messing around. It was summertime. He was messing around in the gym, and there was a bunch of sheetrock standing against the stage. And he was looking for his dad, and he couldn't find him. And nobody knows exactly what happened, but Eddie had a bad temper, and you could see the footprint where he kicked the wallboard, and then he walked away. And when he kicked it, it fell forward. And I didn't find him, but his dad found him. And we lived in a town of like 900 people. I mean, it's a real small town. It's a logging town. And 10 minutes later, everybody in town knew that Eddie Breidenbaugh was dead. And I started having that dream. Now, the dream I had was a 7-year-old dream, so I had to change it a little bit for the sledding hill. But I would have this dream where Eddie and I would be up on this sledding hill. It was a hill right up behind my house.
Oh my God.
And I would dream that Eddie was back and he wanted to go sledding, and the rules were the same as you read in the book. You know, he couldn't guide. And I remember in the dream I would lay down on the sled, and Eddie was supposed to lay down on my back, and I couldn't feel him. So I kind of knew he was a ghost. But when you're 7, you don't really have you're just starting to get the concept of death. You get gone, okay. You've had people, you've probably lost people that you've never seen again. But you don't get the concept of death really as a human being, developmentally, until you're about 7. So that was on the front end of it for me. So that was a real thing. I didn't have a lot of trouble writing that because I can still remember what I felt like. It's just really confusing to me. It's less confusing to a 14-year-old, obviously, but it's, then it's just grief. It's unfairness. So when Eddie and the tire blowing up in his dad's face and killing him didn't happen to my dad, but it happened to my granddad. And it didn't kill him. It almost did. It didn't kill him, but he died a little bit later that same year of a heart attack. And they weren't related, I don't think, but in my mind they were. So when I remembered my granddad, It was not long after a truck tire blew up in his face that he was gone. So I took those two things together. And again, when you're writing fiction, you get to make stuff up. You get to put it the way you want it. So that was where I flipped around. Now, the minute I put those events in, it's pretty easy to make the characterizations work. Because, you know, everybody knows what it feels like to lose something that you really, really wish you didn't have to lose. I mean, it can be a pet, it can be a friend, it can be a family member, but you don't get very old in this culture without losing something. So if I write that and I get it right, I get the feelings right, I get the loss right, you'll recognize it as well as I will.
Renee.
How did you find the right balance of magic realism and aesthetic art?
Another good question, because almost all my other books, and certainly every book before The Sledding Hill, didn't have any of that in it. Everything that I had written up to that time was straight out first person narrator. I think a couple of them are third, but they're nothing that happened in the book was something that couldn't happen. The balance for me came the minute I decided to kill off Billy. When I decided to kill off Billy and let him be the narrator, what got into my head was, okay, there's one piece here that's magic, and that's the fact that a dead kid is telling the story. Everything else, I got to get you to buy that, and that is the world of magical realism. You got to get the reader to buy the premise. And I thought, okay, if I can get you to buy the premise that Billy's out there floating around trying to help his buddy, that's not too hard to get, because any of us would do that for our best friends. If we could, we'd do it. And then I think everything else has to be real. So everything that my little ghosty guy sees is what happens in the real world. But he gets to operate out here in the world of magic. In other words, because he can communicate, and he's not communicating, he's kind of communicating with Eddie, but mostly he's communicating with us. So he's my avenue to you. So the balance is, this one thing I'll get you to buy, everything else has to be real.
Mr. Crutcher, thank you for talking with us today. It was a great privilege. We were very honored. And is there anything else you'd like to tell us? But we have one last question. Do you still love Oreos?
I kind of got tired of Oreos. The first time I started working for my dad in his service station when I was 10 years old, and when I got my first paycheck, I went out and bought a whole bunch of them. I mean, enough to make me sick. In fact, at the end of it, and I wrote a story about it one time, and I think I used chocolate-covered graham crackers. But at the end of the second or third bag of Oreos, I was sitting up on a hill throwing them at cars. People were all of a sudden having their windshields hit by Oreos. So I'll still eat Oreos, but I eat them just two at a time. The one thing that I would say before we wrap it up is, anybody there who likes to write and who wants to get published someday, don't ever let anybody tell you can't do it. The one thing that would have stopped me was that I had this voice in my head that said, you're being too big for your britches. You don't have any ideas that anybody wants to read. Blah, blah, blah. You know, that voice of self-doubt that tells you can't do it. Or the voice that you hear when you start getting writer's block. Or that voice that you say, I can't be a writer, I don't have enough experiences. I'll guarantee you, every person in that room has at least enough experiences for 2 or 3 good books already. If you stay within your own wheelhouse, if you stay within what you know and what you can imagine. And the older you get, You got to study real hard. You got to get the language down, get grammar down, all those kind of things that you hate to do. That the English teachers make us do that we don't want to do them, because you're going to need every one of them. But if you want to be a writer, don't ever let anybody tell you can't do it. Everybody says, oh, it's really hard to get published. It's really hard to get published. It is hard to get published. But if you think nobody's getting published, look around your library. There are books all over the place. Go down to Barnes & Noble. There are books all over the place. Go down to the public library. There are books all over the place. People are getting published. If you want to bad enough, you'll get to the place where you find the thing you can write and you'll get published. Read like crazy if you want to get published, because you can't be a writer without being a reader. I cheated my way through high school, and so I wasn't a writer till I was 35 years old, because I had to go back and read the books that I used my brother's old book reports I recycled. But I had to go back and read. And I cheated myself out of 10 years of writing probably by not reading. So read a lot if you want to be a writer. Anytime something moves you, write it down. But those will be the things that come out that'll turn into those will be your ideas when you finally sit down and tell a story. And you can do it. Don't ever let anybody tell you you can't. And that goes for any kind of art. Any kind of art. And I thank you guys. And it's as much a privilege to come into your place as it is for you to come to my place.
You guys want to say?
Thank you.
Awesome. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, Mr. Crutcher.
Bye-bye.